Hi there. My name's Alexandra Robinson. I'm the Global Gender-Based Violence Advisor for UNFPA based in our headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. And I would love to introduce to you my colleague, Tori Dart. Over to you, Tori.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Dart, or Tori. I am also based in UNFPA headquarters in Nairobi, in the GBV team. I work specifically on technology-facilitated gender-based violence under our global program, Making All Spaces Safe.
Thanks, Tori. So we've been asked to have a conversation about data privacy, security, and responsible innovation in order to help as part of the Next Wave Innovation Challenge. I just will preface this conversation today with the fact that we're not necessarily saying don't go and collect data or do go and collect data, but what we would like you to do, or what we think is important to do, is to think about all the risks associated with data collection. And so maybe we could start by talking about data privacy and security, and why we should think about that right from the beginning of a project rather than at the end. Tori, I don't know if you have any pretty quick reflections on that.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to, I suppose, preface this quick discussion with is the concept of safety by design. You may or may not have heard of it. The audience, not you, Alex, I know you've heard of it. But basically, the premise is when you approach tech design through safety by design principles, also privacy by design and security by design, it means you're embedding privacy and safety directly into the whole life cycle of the development of a tech product or an app or a platform. And you're doing that from the very, very beginning. It's not something you are thinking about when you do, and you might do a gender impact assessment halfway through, or you think about it at the very end because there's a checkbox that the donor wants. It's nothing like that. You are thinking about this from the very beginning. And then you do it in design stage, the deployment stage, monitoring and evaluation. That safety is really at the center of the design.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. I think also really good to consider that we know that not everyone has access to technology as well. So, when we're thinking about deployment, understanding the digital divide or who can access the product is really important, because that can also then create, discrimination or it can build discrimination into the actual tech build, as an aside. But we know that there are lots of different types of data that are really sensitive, that require extra care. And I think some of that data is any identifying information. So who someone is, where they live, what their phone number might be, what community they live in, but also what their access to healthcare has looked like. For example, collecting data on an adolescent girl who might be accessing information around sexual reproductive health could be really, really sensitive in a given community. So I think it's really important to understand that there's many, many risks associated with the collection of data, particularly where it's not safe and secure. And as part of that, and I mentioned it briefly, but is the risk of collecting location or geospatial data, either on an individual but a community. And I don't know, Tori, my feeling is there's so many risks associated with that, which we would be using in climate spaces, because it's really important to understand the impact of climate as a geospatial issue. But I guess really important to think about, can that data, if that data is accessed because you haven't locked it down, perpetrators might then be able to access where somebody lives or what their movements might be. Or I think we saw the example in Ethiopia of drone footage. So the way drones are being used to deliver services, for example, they're actually capturing satellite images as they fly. And the problem with that is if that data then gets into the wrong hands, and that data can then be used to target communities in bad ways, but also individuals. Obviously, I don't know if you had other ideas about, the kinds of risks associated with location data.
No, I had the exact same thoughts, Alex. So in my head, I kind of categorize the risks as in the individual and then the community risks. I mean, ultimately, if you have geolocation tags, you're essentially giving a map to a perpetrator or a potential perpetrator as to where a user is going about their daily life. And I think, it seems almost obvious when you have this with geospatial data and geolocation data, but also just metadata. Which for those who don't know, and I hope I do justice to this quite complex data, but essentially metadata is data about data. And even that kind of data, which I think a lot of people think of as quite harmless, once you have access to that, you then know, for example, where someone is, if someone is accessing services, even if you cannot read those messages, you still have information about the service that they've accessed. And so if that gets into the hands of a malicious actor, then that means potentially they can be perpetrating physical violence or real world violence. And then that second cohort that you mentioned, Alex, the kind of community exposure, you've got vulnerable settlements, particularly in climate affected contexts. We have migration routes. You're potentially exposing vulnerable populations or marginalized groups to surveillance or targeting, depending on the context or, whether there's state surveillance involved. So, this is all to say that it doesn't mean, as you said at the beginning, we're not saying categorically do not collect this data. It is to do a proper risk assessment and a threat actor modeling, because these all need to be taken into account.
Yeah, so true. I had another thought while you were talking, and I've just completely forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, the best way of explaining what I was thinking of, metadata. The best way I think of explaining it is like, instead of having the content of if you think of a book as your data set, the metadata is the data is the chapter headings. So when you look at the table of contents, that's essentially what your metadata is. So for anyone who doesn't know what metadata is and needs a very layperson's view of the world, that's how I understand it. So I think we kind of touched on, I think we've kind of touched on some of the issues around safety, security, privacy by design, some threat modeling. But the other question was, a primary way in which we can prevent harms is through meaningful informed consent. And I think it's really important that we understand what that is and what that looks like in practice. I don't know, Tori, if you want to speak to that one, or I can take it.
I think we'll probably both have something to say on the issue of consent, because it really is the bread and butter of a lot of UNFPA work. But I think when we're talking about data, for me, is this issue that for someone to give their data, particularly really sensitive data, personally identifiable data or information, the consent needs to be not a one-off kind of checkbox. It needs to be an ongoing and continuous dialogue, because I think sometimes data is collected for a particular purpose, and perhaps the person handing over their data is told that purpose, and then that purpose evolves, or the use of that data evolves. That really needs to be, you really need to be checking back in with the person who handed over their data to see if they're still okay with how you're going to be using it. I think the second thing I wanted to flag is that I think consent is often sought and it's hidden in a bunch of legalese, where I think it's really our responsibility to be explaining exactly what data we're collecting, what we are using it for, how long we're storing it, how we are storing it. Is it being stored on a safe and secure and encrypted platform, for example? And if there is going to be any sharing with third parties for whatever reason, then that is also clearly articulated in any kind of consent, and also preferably written consent, if possible.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, Alex, if you had anything else to add on that.
All I would say is that sometimes it's really hard to obtain what we call informed consent. And I think, as you said, sometimes it's buried in like terms and conditions that are really, really long. I think being able to explain upfront exactly what people are consenting to around the collection and use of their data is super important in really, really easy to access terms. And as you say, an active opting in instead of a default opt-in. So you actually have to click, yes, I do agree to all of these different things, and make sure that at different points in time you get prompts so that you can opt out of it at any given point in time. I think that's a point we often, I think, forget, that, you know, it's ongoing. It's not just a one-off. The other, I think, point here that's kind of interesting is, like, how do we make sure, or how do we balance collecting all the useful data that we need with respecting privacy and dignity? And I would go back to a fundamental premise that do not collect the data at all if you don't need to collect it. Because once you collect that data, it's really, really hard to get rid of. And it's really hard to get rid of safely. So I think for us, when we talk about data, particularly when it's personal data, don't collect it if you don't have to. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. I think the other way you can do it is actually de-identify it as soon as, you know, so never actually have identifiable data that you've collected. It will always be de-identified data. The other way of doing that I've seen is the creation of synthetic data sets. So you might have personalized data for some reason, but you immediately convert that over into synthetic data. So it's all been totally depersonalized, and then use that data set to try and help shape what it is that you want to do. I guess so. There are ways and means of getting the kind of efficacy in the product that you want, or in the innovation that you want. But I would also say, you know, the first question is, why do you need that data in the first place? And then the second one is, what are the alternatives if it's personalized? I don't know if there's any other questions or principles around that one that you can think of, but they would be the two fundamental processes I would go through.
No, I completely agree. I think particularly asking that question is, why are we collecting the data? We sometimes do refer to it, and I don't know if we were going to mention this later, Alex, but we do have a safe and ethical guidance on developing tech. So we might come back to that later. But that piece, essentially purpose limitation, right? We're specifically asking, why are we collecting this data? Because automatically that will limit and specify the type of data you are collecting in order to reach the goal that you're heading towards. I think with M&E, and I think with especially if you've got kind of these deliverables or you've got KPIs, the idea is just people just collect all the data that they possibly can, and they're like, we'll use it eventually, or maybe we don't, and it will sit and it sits in storage, and we don't actually do anything with it. And you and I, Alex, have had meetings with many organizations who, when we ask them, why are you collecting this data, they can't actually answer it. And then when you dig a little deeper, they say, oh, actually, it's not even being used. And so that's incredibly dangerous or sensitive data if that got into the wrong hands for absolutely no reason. So this is all to say, I completely agree with the 2 points you made, and just to drill down on how important it is.
And maybe, Tori, I can ask you then, off the back of that, what you see as some of those fundamental ways in which data can be misused.
Where to begin? Okay. So I think, firstly, as data collectors, if you are not putting in these safeguards that we've kind of been discussing, you can actually be negligent actors. So you can actually be almost a perpetrator of violence, potentially, of technology facilitated violence, if you are negligent with the data that you have, because that data, if that then is leaked or your system is hacked, that data can then be misused, abused. It gets into the hands of malicious actors, and then it's exploitation, extractivism, it's technology facilitated gender-based violence, it is potentially doxing. So, you know, we Alex and I, as we preface, we work predominantly in gender-based violence. So, you know, you have women and gender diverse people in safe houses. That information is not properly looked after by those who are collecting the data. Suddenly you have addresses of safe houses that puts everyone at risk. So I think it's so important that even if you are, you know, obviously you all are not going to be perpetrators of violence, but just through negligence, not through not conducting proper risk assessments or threat actor mapping or modeling, then you're potentially putting these vulnerable populations at risk. And even if you don't have, sorry, last point, Alex, even if you don't have, you know, let's say you don't have a malicious actor. Let's say you don't have state surveillance. So there's no one really waiting in the wings for this information. What can potentially happen is once that data is leaked, once it's out in the world, data is incredibly profitable for organizations. So that information can then be sold or brokered. And suddenly you have these tech platforms, these tech companies with all this information about these really vulnerable populations. So really the risks are huge without safeguards.
Yeah, so true. I think I had forgotten that the monetary side of data. I think data is considered the new oil of the world, and we've gone from producing very, very small amounts of data to huge reels of data, which are then used by companies to make profit. So super important to think about what that means once it's in the wrong hands. I think, Tori, you already touched on the safe and ethical guidance. It's the guidance on safe and ethical design of technology to address gender-based violence and harmful practices. But even though that guidance speaks to just gender-based violence and harmful practices as examples, it's actually applicable to all the technology that we develop. So if you're looking at designing an app or a website, chatbot, reporting platform, that guidance can be a fundamental document to use. I would also say, in addition to the guidance, we've developed an assessment checklist so that you as a designer, developer, or engineer or practitioner can actually use that assessment checklist to try and help you understand where you might be falling short of safety, security, privacy by design. So it's a really, really important and valuable tool to be able to use just to check your own products. I would also say that AI is a form of technology, and it's not immune from any of the kinds of issues that Tori and I have been talking about. In fact, AI is driven by data itself. So really, really important to, and the guidance on safe and ethical design of technology and the assessment checklist speak to websites, apps, and chatbots, etc., in the same way that they would AI. So you can't really see them as separate. They still sort of form part of that family of technology, and really, really important to think of it. I think one of the what we can maybe wrap up with, Tori, is how do we make sure, or what are some really fundamental principles that we can help every Next Wave participant follow as part of their project idea? I have 4, but maybe you might have more, or maybe 5, actually. I think I have 5. one of them is don't collect the data if you don't need it. So, and if you do need it, then minimize it and just make sure that what data you do collect is strongly addresses the purpose for its collection. The second one is if you do collect it, make sure you have informed consent and ongoing informed consent. The next one is make sure that users are involved in the design and deployment. So just make sure that your product is meeting an actual demand, and that its uptake is able to be used in a way that is user friendly, and doesn't pose any risk of harm. And by that, I think having my fifth one then is just making sure you have systems of threat modeling. So make sure you run through that product or whatever the innovation is with users to see at every different point, both in terms of design, but then also in how they use it and access it. And just making sure that, every part of that process is safe, or any kind of risks that might come up are mitigated. I don't know. Did you have a number 6, Tori?
I think I just wanted to maybe add 2. I think leaning on the expertise of different cohorts. So building on what you were just talking about with user involvement. So if you come from a tech background, and you are building a SRH app, then collaborate with SRH experts, because they will be able to help you to undertake kind of a threat actor mapping or modeling, and do a proper risk assessment. If you come from a gender and GBV background where you feel really confident in protecting survivors and the sensitive survivor data, do collaborate and consult throughout the lifespan with ICT experts, because they actually might bring more of a cybersecurity kind of lens. So lean into all your expertise. You don't need to do it alone, and collaborate across teams and across cohorts. And then I think really I just want to end with the first point that I made at the very beginning of this, was just do not do this halfway through or at the end as a checkbox. Really, this should be almost your starting point. When you know, talking to what Alex said, the first question is, why are we collecting data? What is it for? And then if we are collecting this data, what are the risks and how do we mitigate it? These should be your fundamental first questions, and everything else comes after.
Thanks so much, Tori. I think, unless we have anything further to add, I think that's a wrap. Thanks very much for listening to us, and good luck. All the best. Bye.
Thanks, Alex. Bye.